Thank you so much. I was just commenting to someone before that I hope someday we invent the ability to change the PowerPoint talk as we are in the present moment, changing what we want to say. So if anybody gets inspired to help children somewhere learn how to do that in the future, because the thing I became aware of is that that was the past, and I'm in the present. So I'm very glad that you're going to get the whole PowerPoint, because what might start happening is that I'm going to zoom past and say, no, that's not relevant, this kind of thing. The other thing I'd like to start off with is a story that came back to me this morning in meditation. And whenever that happens, I feel that it's not only for me to remember, but to possibly share it as a learning. And it probably comes out of the discussion we've been having around this concept of hypervigilance. So this is a true story of a young man who was in our program in East Harlem, went to Central Park East High School, and it was at a time in New York City where kids were being killed, literally, for not giving over their sheepskin coats. I don't know if you actually remember this, but there were a series of incidents where, a crowd of kids would come over to a kid, say, give me your coat, and they didn't want to do it, and literally they were shot. And literally there was a series of this happening in New York City. And Raymond got up from the subway one morning, and the dead of winter, wearing his sheepskin coat, and sure enough, in moments, he was surrounded by a group of kids who, one of whom took out a knife and sure enough said, give me a sheepskin coat. And with this, a smile came over his face, and he said, this is absolutely amazing. I was just getting ready to do that. And he took off the coat very calmly, handed it to the kids as they ran away. But the story is not over. He was very near his school, so he came right back to his school and walked right into class. And then his anger began to surface, and his fear began to surface, and all of those things. But what did he have? He had a group of kids who listened to him. And not only did he have a group of kids who listened to him, one guy in the back immediately said, how much was that coat? And he told him, and he says, I'm doing the math. We all have to bring in 87 cents by tomorrow, and you've got your coat back. So I guess I've remembered that story because I feel like it's a good example of what we want to have happen when we do this work with kids. Here was this young man who, because he regulated himself and knew how to do that and was taught how to do that, he could think creatively, and it was sure an amazing intervention he made. Staying in a very calm place, but also with positive feelings, definitely catching them off guard, but then knowing that there were other places he could share these things, and there would be a loving, compassionate response to that in his school community. And not only that loving, compassionate response had the creative idea of actually buying him his coat. And that's in fact what happened, by the way. That's in fact what happened. So it just gives me a little bit of a vision of where we want to go with this work. That we want to be able to have that quality that was part of that story to be embedded in the work that we do. I think a lot of educators are asking this big question. I know that many of us are asking it in the room. And we're also asking, how can school be less about preparing children for a life of tests and more about preparing them for the tests of life. Because clearly that's what Raymond needed, you know? That's what he needed. And it really is one that in the field of education today is probably taking more of our energy than anything else. It's shifting this honest-to-goodness paradigm that's very rooted in just about everything we do in education right now. When I think about bringing this work into schools, I do come from a little bit of a bias in that I feel like the work of social and emotional learning, which has been around now for a good couple of decades and is more to the front in the last decade, gives us some solid evidence that schools particularly need to begin to think about bringing this kind of work in schools. Because if you take a look at this is a framework many of us know in the field of SEL. You see, these are the kinds of things that we talk about when we talk about social and emotional learning. And you look at this set of competencies, and again you say, wow, that's what we've been talking about in terms of what mindfulness does. So there's a real interconnection between these two fields, and they're in different places, but I think that one could clearly inform the other, and it's almost like one is creating the fertile ground for the other, or in some cases, vice versa. And we've talked about this, we've talked about, so we think we have some guesses around what might be some of the benefits of contemplative practice in schools. And you saw this slide in many versions. So we have this hint that doing some things more intentionally in the, as Tobin Hart says, the internal technologies of the mind may have some increased benefits, and particularly if they're added to the work of social and emotional learning that's already happening in schools. So how is this done? Well, it's done through, first of all, educators experiencing that themselves. And we've talked a lot about this. This is probably the one thing that, if it jumps into education, is going to transform education. Why? Because it's really saying, no, you can't go to number 2 before number 1 happens. Now, some of us are going to number 2, where we're working directly with kids, but I think several of us are of the opinion that it may fall quite short, because this set of beliefs and concepts and skills depend on us, ourselves, being the vehicles of that. I remember that I didn't particularly love geography as a classroom teacher, but I don't think any of the kids knew it. I tried to kind of cover that up, and I think they learned to love that. But here, it's a whole other story. And then the third way is enhancing the learning environment itself. So these are the 3 ways I think of when I think of bringing this work into schools. Many of you know about the work of the Inner Resilience Program. We began in the wake of September 11th. I'm not going to kind of go into that a whole lot. You can read about that on the website. We're in the marketplace. But what happened for us is that we began to say, there's this whole body of knowledge and work in the field of social and emotional learning, and there's this burgeoning new work as we're looking at what value might be added to social and emotional learning through contemplative practice. And so we began to realize that that really is our vision. That is our mission. And you could see that this was a while back, but oh my goodness, there's Mark's interpersonal and interpersonal. Like we ourselves, when we did our first set of research, said, well, our logic model is saying that there is some intrapersonal change we would expect and some interpersonal change we would expect. And that was transformative in nature, which I think is a little different, although we've said that. And then what we would expect to see is changes both in the classroom climate, but then actual changes in the students. And so we do this in a variety of ways, but first, more than anything, we pay attention to the teachers. So we offer teachers weekly sessions, monthly sessions, weekend retreats, go to schools and do what's called stress reduction days. This is like the full-on model of the work. Teachers get professional development days, and we encourage those days to be used for this topic so that the whole staff is getting some things as well. There's a monthly gathering with school administrators, and one of our 14 people are here in the room. Betty Toomey is right here. So we do that about 10 times a year. It's a monthly gathering and great attendance, and even though it's 7:30 in the morning. In fact, a couple of years ago, we did ask this question: well, what about paying a little more attention to the administrators? And we realized that they had different reasons for wanting to do this work, as you could see. And it seems as though it had, according to personal reports, quite a good effect on them. And again, I'm going to move through these quickly because you're going to be able to see these slides later. So what we're really trying to do first with this work is to really work with the adults. Why? Because we have various research that tells us that. And this is just one of many things that tells us that. The first bit of research and the second bit of research. And then Mark and others, Mark Brackett and others, that when we pay attention to the adults and they are able to more readily embody these skills, then they are in a prime place to be giving that to kids. And then direct instruction may have a role. These kids are learning about breathing. They're learning what happens with breathing. They're learning lots of different things about the body. And this is done through a curriculum that is also a book. And these are kids just learning some of these skills in the context of a classroom. If you stop by the marketplace, we have a biodot for everyone downstairs. We use this a lot to sort of help kids learn about their own physiology and then some of the differences they see in that physiology when they are in a state of relaxed alertness, and basically just helping them tune into that. There's a lot of coaching and classroom visits in our model. Why? Because we feel like in order to this to be part of people's active repertoire, we really have to hang in there with the teachers quite a bit as they do this work. That it's not so easy to be inspired in a place like this and then say, I don't understand why that didn't inspire you to do it on Monday morning. Well, you know, there's a lot of other things we wouldn't be able to put in what we would call our active repertoire by just one inspirational conference or one-day workshop, or et cetera, et cetera. So hanging in there is important. And then the ability for these teachers to actually model, and I would even use the word embody this, which is probably the loudest lesson of all, as we've talked about. And then to create an environment where this work is very welcoming. And in most of the cases with our work, kids help with the teacher create what's called a peace corner. And as a kid will tell you from Vermont, when he was in the peace corner and he saw a journalist writing, he said, this is a good thing. He says, this isn't like a cool-off corner. He says, I chose to come here. Last week I was in Youngstown, and one of the teachers, I asked the teachers to imagine if in the last couple of weeks you had a camera in your back pocket and you took a picture of a sign of hope that this work was alive and well in your classroom. So all of a sudden a couple of teachers said, so-and-so, you've got to tell her the Peace Corner story. And so here it is, because It's really amazing. Second grade boy went to the Peace Corner, and lo and behold, somebody else was there. And he came back to the teacher and he said, you know I should never interrupt anybody in the Peace Corner, but I really needed the Peace Corner. He says, so we really need 2 Peace Corners. And she said to him, and she's very nice, she said, Jason, she said, take a look at this room, how crowded it is. She said, it would be really hard to have 2 Peace Corners. And he says, you got 3 options. Underneath the computer table, over there, or over there. And she said, wow, some creative thinking happening, Jason. That was it. Roll it, day 2. 3 pillows, 1 blanket, and decides which is going to be the second Peace Corner, and comes and creates it. Now this is also saying to me lots of other things, of course, right, that you're already thinking. This is the poorest school district in the entire state of Ohio, where for kids to feel that safety and quiet and ability to go within, the yearning for that first of all, suggesting it, but it's also saying to me, looks like this work helps kids give themselves quite a voice, because he actually acted on his idea, and he had a teacher who was welcoming of that. So all of those things were in play there. We use the concept of infusion a whole lot with this work. Literature is a perfect example of infusing this work, but I think that as we bring this work into schools, we've got to think more and more of how to infuse it into the other curriculum areas, that it becomes easier and easier for teachers to be doing these kinds of practices throughout the day. And then, of course, we work a lot with parents, and Elizabeth Slade is in the room. We just started in Mamaroneck, and yesterday was the final parent workshop, and, tears and transformational stuff happening, with this work. And it's important to include parents in that process. So what's unique? And I think this is the part where a lot of us have said some of this already, but first of all, that we feel like paying attention to the inner life is worth doing. That's first of all the whole mind shift that has to happen, that paying attention to the inner life matters. And then that it's important, and it's important not only for the children, which is how most things come into schools, oh, this will be better for the kids, but it is important for the adults, probably even more. And that there's a real notion, and we talked about this, of interdependence and impermanence, that everyone and everything's connected, and change is a real feature of that. We do an activity where kids come in the morning, and for younger kids, there are all feelings boxes, and they take their name and they put it into a feeling box, and then the teacher just says, oh, we have some happy people today, and we have some whatever, and does that. But then she always says during the day, because feelings change, this is the mindfulness piece of the same activity, she says, I'm going to give you a moment if anybody wants to check in again with themselves and see if where they put their little name at 9 o'clock is where you are now. And sure enough, some kids get up. Well, no, it isn't. It isn't. Well, what are they learning? This is incredible, right? That feelings come and go, thoughts come and go, and that I can notice that. And this is where my question comes in to Adele, that I do believe that it does involve some disciplined practices in which some things are repeated so that it does do what you talked about. And I think this is, we don't know a lot about this yet, but I do feel that that's part of it. And then that this is the part we've been talking about too, that we're talking about a relational context. We're not talking about, oh, I did that school, which means I I can't, I had kids close their eyes, and I'm counting how many did that, and that school does meditation, that school does contemplative practice, whatever. We're talking about counting only when that is being done in this relational context where the whole issue of really bringing the full range of human capacities, and really being agents of healing out of a response of compassionate hearts. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a whole wider vision. So what are some things we should be considering in 1 minute or less? This one is a big one. I talk a lot about this in my middle book, Schools with Spirit, but it's one that's very important. And even when we get things from wisdom traditions, how do we begin to integrate them in such a way that it doesn't cause somebody to stumble because we haven't done that work of figuring out how to bring it into the secular world? And then, can they coexist? Or will somebody feel like what you're asking my kid to do is exactly different from what I'm teaching him or her at home? And I would just offer, and I know this is a controversial one, I would just offer the fact that suffering, you take away suffering for Christians, you're in trouble. Would you agree? From that perspective. So again, things that you just sort of think like, oh, we'll all agree that we would want to have less suffering, is not a common set of ideals, right? So it's really looking at the different things that we feel are changes around this work and seeing which ones hold up to a wider vision of universality. And the golden rule is a good one. It's a good idea for that reason. And now, I myself have finished. It's telling me that. It's telling me that. Unless I could barter. I don't know. Here's the barter. 3 minutes? How much? 3 minutes. All right. That was easy. That was easy. Okay. So here we go. We talked about that one. We talked about that one. We did. But I think that the dimensions that CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning, has put out about what we need to think about with good programs are very applicable. Look at this. This is straight from SEL work. Are very applicable for us to have as a little backdrop, right? All of those things we've talked about. And we've talked about some of these things. So a good backdrop in looking at what we know about social and emotional learning and bringing it into this new work. This will be longer, so I won't barter again. What does it look like in a school? Well, first of all, that you become more of a learning organization. That there's self-assessment, inquiry-based stuff, professional development, emphasis on community. It means that you start looking at helping kids to have a practice that could be very varied and exposing them, that we know that these are the ingredients of the instruction that ought to happen. And we also know that we've got to start thinking about bringing all of this into discipline and classroom management so that in a school that is going in this direction, the students are help creating the class agreements, the teachers making sure to use logical consequences, the classroom is calmer, there are ways for the child to self-regulate so that the whole end of things around that end also reflects it. And then finally, that there's a real emphasis on social justice issues, that once you become compassionate, you want to act in a compassionate way, and that this is key for us. And then finally, that the parents are part of it. And many of us know this little piece. It comes from a lot of SEL programs, and I would just leave you with this, that the feeling is that many of us are concerned that the way we're going in education is not really helping us see the value that this work could be, that the problem is we have such a narrow vision of education. The goal is to have a movement dedicated to creating this, and the solution is us. And the consequence can be what we talked about, this sea of change. So let's go and inspire each other as we keep going here. Thank you.